we're joined by Andy Stepanian of Sparrow Media. Andy, thanks for coming out today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
So maybe for the people at home who might not know who you are, tell us about what got you involved in particular, and then start doing media projects and stuff like that, and activism, and kind of combining it with media and journalism.
Well, I got involved with activism probably when I was about 14 years old, and in part through my mother. My mother was one of these like kind of hippie types, and every kid's got to rebel against their parents. So instead of, defaulting on not being involved with activism, my rebellion was more of this like kind of veering away from the hippie styles of activism to more radical styles of activism. When I was 16 years old, I started lobbying for a company called NIPERG regarding the spraying of pesticides, specifically organochlorines that mimic estrogen in a woman's body. And I started lobbying in the state Senate as this kind of youth lobbyist. And I had this really disenfranchising experience of pulling on the pant legs of legislators begging for scraps from the table. And so by the time I was 17 or 18, I kind of had this fall from grace where I decided I'm either not going to be an activist anymore, or I'm going to step up my involvement and I'm going to start pushing back. So instead of begging for scraps from the table, I'm going to start taking them. At that point, I met other individuals that were involved with radical activism. A lot of them were already vegetarian or vegan. We started getting involved with things like undercover investigations into factory farms and the way animals are treated. And I was allured by the whole process because I liked the idea of jumping over fences with a video camera and taping what I thought were illegal practices and creating change that way. And that kind of was a slippery slope to more and more direct actions that were breaking the law in furtherance of my beliefs. By the time I was 20, I went to jail for the first time, first of 3 times. Spent about half my 20s in jail. Towards the end of it, I was charged with a conspiracy count by the FBI. They charged me with the conspiracy count of violating the Animal Enterprise Protection Act for allegedly being involved with a plot to bankrupt a biotechnology company in New Jersey. They alleged that through disruptions on the stock market, we created a $380 million damage to the laboratory and forced them into bankruptcy. They charged us with not a substantive count of any specific material crime, but rather a conspiracy count for this financial disruption. We were sentenced between 1 and 6 years. I got 3 years in federal prison and was designated as a terrorist to a high security unit in Marion, Illinois, where I stayed with individuals from Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Shabaab, and various martyr brigades. So it was an eye-opening experience for me, and I knew that when I came home, I couldn't keep doing the same types of direct actions that I was doing. Already my kind of voice went from being in the margins to being kind of elevated on this platform. There was an animal rights movement that was taking its prisoners and trying to treat them as like folk heroes, which in its own way is problematic because we didn't know what was best for the movement. But now all of a sudden we have this voice. What are we going to do with it? So I came home, and when I came home, I had various pen pals when I was in prison, and we had talked about the need for social justice movements to have publicists, but only the highest grossing NGOs and nonprofits can afford publicists. So we decided to devise this kind of scheme wherein 2/3 of the clientele of a publicity agency would receive the services for free, while 1/3 received paid services that would cover the costs of the other 2/3. And that's where the Sparrow Media Project was born.
So for people out there, tell us about the latest projects you've been doing. We talked about also earlier, you produced that interview that Alexa O'Brien did with Chelsea's attorney, David Coombs. Maybe tell some people about that and behind the idea behind that.
Well, I mean, supporting Chelsea Manning was part of some of the stuff that we've done recently, but so after about 3.5 years of being out of prison, we started getting more and more involved, myself and about 3 of my friends. And periodically I found myself able, whether or not we had grants or paid clients, able to take on other paid positions for other individuals to help out with projects. So the more resources we had, the grander our projects became. After about 3 years of being involved, journalists start to get to know me personally on a personal level. They understood when they received a phone call from me that it wasn't just some crackpot talking about a story, but it was rather trying to figure out an angle on how to report on a social justice issue while understanding the parameters in which a lot of these mainstream journalists work, and understanding they usually need an event to peg it to or something in the mainstream media cycle to kind of re-inject this issue back in. So it was this kind of back and forth where they got to know us. Our projects got to be a little bit more high profile, and instead of being involved with 1 or 2 projects per year, we started getting involved with as many as 20 or 30 projects per year. Some of the most recent ones that we did, we did some freelance support of the Occupy Wall Street movement, wherein we did press releases for them. We did the initial press releases for Occupy Sandy. We are not in any type of managerial position, and we don't claim to have a voice for Occupy Sandy. Instead, what happened in the beginning there was individuals wanted to start this affinity group called Occupy Sandy. They put together essentially a page of copy, and then they had a call for volunteers. And what we did is we shopped it to journalists, over 1,000 journalists in an evening, while the power was still out around here, calling for volunteers at various hubs around the city, and that kind of was the catalyst for Occupy Sandy. What we do through Sparrow Media is not the on-the-ground organizing, but rather getting the word out so the on-the-ground organizers don't have to worry about flyering, leafleting, getting people to their events, or getting blurbs in the newspapers. So we do that work for them. Some of the work with the Manning proceedings, most recently we supported, and we've been supporting for quite some time, outstanding journalist named Alexa O'Brien. Alexa O'Brien has done tireless work, part of it in Bahrain in the beginning through a website called US Day of Rage, and then became prominent as a plaintiff in the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit against the National Defense Authorization Act, specifically targeting the subsection that allows for indefinite detention. So she was suing under the pretext of her journalistic privileges may put her in jeopardy of being prosecuted or detained indefinitely underneath the NDAA. And we supported her by bringing this story, bringing this narrative into the mainstream media. At first, we watched an arc through the start of this lawsuit. The only people reporting on it in the beginning were fringe media outlets. Halfway through, we had a really big problem, and was overcoming a hurdle in part from radical communities, because conspiratorial websites kind of grabbed a hold of the NDAA issue. And I'm not saying they're not allowed to talk about it. Of course they're allowed to talk about whatever they want. But what happened was, it was so prominent that if you Googled it, you would pull up conspiratorial website after conspiratorial website. So as I'm trying to pitch a journalist from a mainstream outlet or an MSNBC, and their assistant producers are Googling the issue, the first things that come up are whether Alex Jones or something like that. And this is not to disparage those websites or those individuals, but it was making our work harder. So that was at about month 6. By about month 9 or month 10, all of a sudden we saw a change in everything, and part of that had to do with the white papers that came out through NBC. It was a very mainstream outlet that released these white papers that had to do with the targeted killing list. And when that came out, all of a sudden the floodgates opened for us to now inject or have this event to peg the NDAA issue too, as well as there was a court date coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks after that on, I think it was February 6th of 2013. And what we did is we created this media flurry around that, and we got mainstream media attention surrounding the National Defense Authorization Act as it now approaches the Supreme Court. And again, it's an ongoing court battle, but Alexa O'Brien's prominence as a journalist, as well as an activist and a plaintiff in this case, kind of skyrocketed. Consistently from the beginning through this Manning trial, she has tirelessly covered the Manning trial. And so what we thought we'd do as kind of like a thank you to Alexa was to go down there and to support her in producing the first exclusive interview with David Coombs to allow all the information to come out in an environment that was supportive of David Coombs, allow him to control the narrative, allow Manning's attorney to get the words out that Manning needed to get out at that time, and we were able to then shop that message to the world. It aired on Democracy Now! The next day. About 3 hours after we shot the interview, a portion of it went up on Huffington Post and circulated to about 18,000 individuals, 18,000 impressions, which was good. And then bits and pieces of it appeared elsewhere later on. We ultimately uploaded it to Vimeo, where now it's available for free for anyone to download and embed on their site, use or chop and edit whatever way they want.
Party when it began. They're good friends of mine. I agree with them on many issues and I disagree on others. It's not about that. And I think young people get it. It's not left versus right. At this point, it's right versus wrong. At this point, it's freedom versus tyranny.
And where do you see it heading as a trend?
Well, I see it being a lot more decentralized, which is a good thing in a lot of ways, because corporate media, as I'm sure you and your viewers are quite aware, prefers not to cover certain topics.